My wife abandoned me when I was diagnosed with cancer at 29. "You're too expensive to save," she said, cutting all contact. 5 years later, I survived and worked 3 jobs to pay medical bills. Last week, a lawyer knocked on my door with documents about a $63 million medical research inheritance. He smiled and said, "The donor specifically requested you." Look, I'm not saying I believed in fairy tales or anything, but when you're standing at the altar promising someone forever, you kind of assume forever means more than just the good Instagram moments. You know, the whole package. Vacations, arguments about whose turn it is to do the dishes, maybe even holding hands during the scary parts. But apparently, when they make you recite those wedding vows about in sickness and in health, there's this invisible asterisk nobody mentions, the one that says terms and conditions apply in font size -12. Mine? Oh, mine had a real specific clause tucked away in the fine print. Unless saving you costs more than a mid-range sedan and requires actual emotional labor. I was 29 years old, which is supposed to be this golden age where you're figuring your life out, maybe buying your first real furniture that doesn't come from IKEA, possibly considering whether you want kids or just really committed houseplants. Instead, I was sitting in a hospital bed that smelled like industrial-strength bleach and broken dreams, with tubes snaking out of my arms like I was some kind of low-budget science experiment. The IV drip made this rhythmic beeping sound that I'd already started to hate, and the fluorescent lights overhead were doing that flicker thing that makes you feel like you're trapped in a horror movie. Nobody bothered to give it a decent budget. That's when Chloe walked in. My wife, the woman I'd promised my life to approximately 14 months earlier, at a ceremony that cost more than my car and featured a 3-tiered cake nobody actually liked. She stood at the foot of my bed wearing those designer heels I'd bought her for Christmas, the ones she said made her feel powerful. And honestly, she looked more inconvenienced than concerned, like she'd just been informed her favorite brunch spot was closed for renovations. Her face had that carefully blank expression people get when they're about to deliver news they've already processed and moved on from, while you're still stuck at the starting line wondering what the hell is happening. "I can't do this," she said. And her voice had this practiced quality to it, like she'd rehearsed this speech in the car on the way over, maybe ran through it a couple times in the hospital parking lot to make sure she hit the right notes of sympathy without actually committing to any real emotion. I remember blinking at her, my brain still foggy from whatever cocktail of medications they'd pumped into me that morning, thinking maybe I'd misheard. Maybe the cancer had already spread to my ears. "Can't do what?" I asked. Because apparently, even when your life is actively falling apart, you still need clarification on exactly how it's happening. "You're too expensive to save," she said. And I swear to God, she said it with the same tone someone uses when they're canceling a streaming service they don't watch anymore. Not Netflix, more like one of those niche channels you subscribe to for one show and forgot about. Clinical, businesslike, already decided. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because what else do you do when your wife just put a price tag on your life and apparently you came in under budget for her concern? The laugh came out weird, kind of strangled, and it hurt my chest where they'd been doing tests all morning. "I'm sorry, did you just cost-benefit analyze our marriage?" Her mother, Beatrice, because of course Beatrice was there, lurking near the doorway like some kind of designer-clad vulture, stepped forward and nodded with this satisfied expression, like she'd just balanced a checkbook and everything came out neat and tidy. Beatrice had never liked me, which I'd known from day one when she asked what my financial prospects were at our engagement dinner. Apparently, graphic designer with student loans wasn't the answer she was hoping for. Now, she was standing there radiating vindication, her arms crossed over her Chanel blazer, probably thinking she'd been right about me all along. "It's for the best," Beatrice said, using that voice people use when they're pretending to be wise but are really just being cruel. You're young, Chloe. You can't throw away your best years on someone who's going to be a financial burden. Financial burden. That's what I'd been reduced to. Not a husband, not a partner, not even a human being fighting for his life. Just a line item on a balance sheet that didn't add up in their favor. Chloe wouldn't even look at me. She studied her manicure instead. Those perfectly painted nails I'd watched her get done just last week while I'd sat in the salon's waiting area scrolling through WebMD trying to convince myself that my symptoms were probably just stress. "I'm sorry," she said, "but it was the kind of sorry people offer when they bump into you at the grocery store, not when they're abandoning their spouse in a cancer ward." "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, because some masochistic part of me needed to know. "Did you decide in the parking lot, or was this a conversation you had over coffee this morning?" She flinched just slightly, but didn't answer. Beatrice put a hand on her shoulder, protective and possessive, already steering her daughter away from the mess she'd married. "We should go," Beatrice said. "You've said what you came to say." And they left, just like that. Chloe's heels clicked on the tile floor, this sharp staccato sound that echoed off the walls and seemed to announce my abandonment to the entire ward. Click, click, click. Each step taking her further away, while I sat there connected to machines that beeped out my heartbeat like some kind of sad metronome. The door swung shut with this pneumatic hiss, and suddenly the room felt about 3 times larger and infinitely more empty. I stared at that door for probably 20 minutes, half expecting her to come back, to burst through with tears and apologies, saying she'd panicked, that she didn't mean it, that fear had made her cruel. But the door stayed closed, and the only sound was the IV drip and the distant murmur of nurses at their station down the hall. That morning, I'd walked into the hospital thinking I'd be dealing with a cancer diagnosis. That seemed like enough, you know? Like that should be the worst thing happening to me on any given Tuesday. But apparently, the universe had looked at my situation and thought, you know what this needs? Let's add some betrayal, some good old-fashioned abandonment. Really give this guy a story to tell. So yeah, I wasn't just diagnosed with cancer that day. I was diagnosed with being broke and inconvenient, with being not worth the effort, with being the kind of investment that didn't yield returns, at least not the kind that mattered to the woman who'd promised to love me forever. Turns out, forever has a price point, and I'd just discovered I couldn't afford it. I looked down at my left hand, at the wedding ring I was still wearing, because taking it off seemed like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet. The gold band caught the fluorescent light, and I thought about how Chloe had slipped it onto my finger just over a year ago, her eyes wet with happy tears, promising me everything while meaning none of it. "In sickness and in health," I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking on the last word. Guess we should have defined our terms. The day after Chloe walked out, I discovered something interesting about hospital ceilings. They're absolutely covered in water stains that look like abstract art if you stare at them long enough. When you've got nothing but time and existential dread, you start seeing patterns. That one up there definitely looked like a duck wearing a top hat. That cluster near the corner could have been a map of Florida, or maybe just proof that hospital maintenance budgets were as depressed as I was. I counted them, like other people count sheep, except instead of falling asleep, I just got better at cataloging my misery in beige and yellow-brown splotches. The nurses had clearly gotten the memo about my situation because they started tiptoeing around my room like I was made of glass, or worse, like I was contagious with bad luck. They'd slip in to check my vitals with these sympathetic smiles that made me want to throw my Jell-O cup at the wall. Though, to be fair, hospital Jell-O isn't really throwable. It just kinda jiggles disapprovingly and stays put. Nobody knew what to say to the guy whose wife had bailed faster than passengers on a sinking ship, so they just said nothing, which somehow felt louder than any conversation could have been. I was in the middle of identifying what I was pretty sure was a water stain shaped like Abraham Lincoln when my door banged open with enough force to make me jump, which hurt because everything hurt, and in walked this woman who clearly hadn't received the "be gentle with the abandoned cancer patient" memo. She was maybe 55, built like someone who'd spent her life pushing back against things that pushed first, wearing a blazer that had seen better days and carrying a binder that looked thick enough to double as a weapon. "You gonna die, or are you gonna get stubborn?" she asked, not even bothering with pleasantries like "hello" or "how are you feeling" or any of that fake sympathy everyone else was drowning me in. I blinked at her, wondering if the morphine drip had kicked in without me noticing and I was hallucinating confrontational social workers. "I'm sorry, is that an option on some kind of form I need to fill out? Because nobody gave me that paperwork." She laughed, this big, genuine sound that seemed completely out of place in a room that had been nothing but whispers and sad looks for the past 24 hours. "Rhonda Pierce," she said, sticking out her hand like we were at a business meeting instead of in a cancer ward where my life was actively imploding. "Social worker, professional pain in the administration's ass, and your new best friend, whether you like it or not." I shook her hand weakly, pretty sure I didn't have the energy to resist whatever hurricane had just blown into my room. "I don't have any money for whatever you're selling." "Good thing I'm not selling anything then," Rhonda said, pulling up the world's most uncomfortable-looking plastic chair and dropping that massive binder on my bed with a thud that made the IV pole rattle. "I'm here to make sure you don't die just because your wife has the emotional capacity of a parking meter." I actually laughed at that, which hurt my chest but felt good in a way that nothing had felt good in days. "You heard about that, huh?" "Honey, everyone on this floor heard about that," Rhonda said, flipping open her binder with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Nurses' station gossip travels faster than hospital Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi here is terrible, so that's saying something. But forget about her. We've got work to do." She started pulling out papers. Forms, pamphlets, printouts that looked like they'd been photocopied so many times the text was starting to blur. Charity programs I'd never heard of. Medical grants I didn't know existed. Financial assistance applications that required more information than my taxes. Payment plans that actually seemed designed for humans instead of trust fund babies. Drug company programs that would cover medications I couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. "This," Rhonda said, tapping the binder with one finger, "is what I call salvation through paperwork. It's not sexy, it's not fast, and it requires more signatures than a celebrity autograph session. But it works. We're going to apply for every single thing you qualify for, and probably some things you don't, because the worst they can say is no, and you're already living through the worst, so what's a few rejection letters?" I stared at the mountain of papers that had just taken over my bed, feeling something that might have been hope trying to claw its way through the depression and abandonment. "Why are you doing this?" Rhonda looked at me over her reading glasses, and her expression softened just a fraction. "Because nobody should have to die alone just because they're broke. And because I'm really good at filling out forms and making administrators uncomfortable. It's like therapy, but I get paid for it." That night, after Rhonda had finally left, taking half the binder with her to photocopy in triplicate, because apparently the universe required everything in triplicate, I was lying there, trying to process the fact that a complete stranger was fighting harder for my life than my own wife had, when I heard humming. Low, melodic, the kind of humming that came from somewhere deep and genuine. Mr. Wallace, the night janitor, was mopping near my door. I'd seen him around for the past few days, but hadn't really registered him as anything more than part of the hospital background noise. Just another person in scrubs, pushing cleaning equipment, and trying to make everything smell less like sickness and more like industrial lemon. He was older, maybe 60-something, with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen pretty much everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. He wasn't talkative, didn't ask me how I was feeling or give me those pitying looks everyone else seemed to have perfected. He just hummed gospel songs, I eventually realized. Old hymns my grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings when I was a kid. The kind of music that felt like someone wrapping a blanket around your shoulders without asking if you were cold first. I noticed he'd left something on my tray table. A pack of crackers, the cheap kind from the vending machine that cost $1 and tasted like cardboard with ambitions of being food. At first, I thought maybe he'd left them there by accident, or maybe he pitied me the same way everyone else did. But then he did it again the next night, and the night after that. Sometimes crackers, sometimes a granola bar, once an apple that looked like it had been smuggled out of the cafeteria. "You don't have to do that," I said one night, my voice rough from not using it much during the day. He paused his mopping, looked at me with these calm eyes that seemed to see right through all the bravado I was trying to maintain. "Everybody's gotta eat," he said simply, then went back to humming and pushing his mop across the floor in slow, methodical strokes. That's when I realized it wasn't pity, it was friendship, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need a lot of words or explanations, the kind that showed up in the form of dollar store crackers and gospel hymns at 2 in the morning when you were lying in the dark wondering if your life was ever going to feel normal again. I had lost a wife, but somehow I'd gained a warrior social worker with a binder thick as a phone book and a janitor who communicated in snacks and spirituals. If this was rock bottom, at least it came with unlikely allies and the distant hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I felt. Chemo is a lot like having a jealous ex-girlfriend, except instead of just keying your car and posting vague accusations on social media, it systematically destroys everything you thought you knew about your body while claiming it's doing you a favor. It's violent in this quiet, insidious way, not a punch to the face, but more like someone slowly turning up the gravity until just existing feels like running a marathon through quicksand. And it's messy. Oh God, is it messy, in ways that the pamphlets with their cheerful stock photos of smiling cancer patients definitely don't prepare you for. The unpredictability was somehow the worst part, like living with a ticking time bomb that might go off during breakfast, or at 3 in the morning, or while you're trying to have a conversation with a nurse about whether lime jello is actually food, or just colored water with trust issues. My hair started leaving before I could even process what was happening, which felt weirdly appropriate, considering Chloe had done the exact same thing. Except my hair was less dramatic about it. No speeches about financial burdens or clicking heels, just gradually abandoning ship in clumps that ended up on my pillow, in the shower drain, basically everywhere, except actually on my head where it was supposed to be. I woke up one morning looking like a patchy lawn that had given up on life. And by the end of the week, I just had the nurse buzz it all off, because pretending I still had hair felt more depressing than just accepting my new aerodynamic reality. At least my hair didn't take the car when it left, which was more than I could say for my ex-wife, so that felt like a minor victory in the world's saddest competition. Rhonda showed up during one of my better days, and by better, I mean I'd only vomited twice instead of my usual 4 times, with news that made me think maybe I'd hallucinated her entire existence. "Got you a job," she announced, dropping another stack of papers on my bed like she was dealing cards in the world's worst poker game. I stared at her, pretty sure the chemo had finally fried the part of my brain that processed reality. I can barely walk to the bathroom without needing a nap. What kind of job could I possibly do? "Remote data entry," she said, completely unfazed by my pessimism, which honestly should have been her superpower. "Company called Data Stream Solutions needs people to input information into spreadsheets. You can do it from your laptop, on your own schedule, and they don't care if you're doing it from a hospital bed or a yacht in the Bahamas. It's $12 an hour, which I know isn't going to make you rich, but it's $12 an hour more than you're making now." $12 an hour. In any other circumstance, I would have laughed at the idea of doing data entry for what amounted to slightly more than minimum wage. I had a college degree, damn it. I'd been a graphic designer with actual clients and a portfolio that didn't completely embarrass me. But graphic design required creativity and energy, and the ability to stare at a screen for more than 15 minutes without wanting to throw up. And chemo had pretty much stolen all of those things from me. So, $12 an hour to type numbers into boxes while fighting the urge to vomit? Yeah, that was exactly the level of ambition my life had achieved. When do I start? I asked, because apparently rock bottom came with a work-from-home opportunity. I started 3 days later, once Rhonda had helped me fill out more paperwork than should be legally required for a job that basically involved copying information from one place to another. Turns out, typing with hands that shake from chemo is its own special kind of hell. Like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake while someone shouts random numbers at you. I'd sit there in my hospital bed with my laptop balanced on one of those rolling tables they use for meals, squinting at spreadsheets that all looked identical, inputting data about shipping manifests or inventory counts or whatever the hell data stream solutions actually did, because honestly, I never really figured that part out and didn't particularly care. The nausea was my constant companion, this rolling wave that would hit without warning and leave me scrambling for the plastic basin the nurses had given me, which I'd started calling my coworker because we spent so much quality time together. I'd be in the middle of a spreadsheet, typing away, feeling almost normal, and then suddenly my stomach would stage a revolt, and I'd have to save my work, lean over, and introduce my coworker to whatever I'd managed to eat that day. Then I'd rinse my mouth, take a few deep breaths, and get right back to work, because nothing says living the dream quite like vomiting between data entries and pretending it's totally normal. But here's the thing about spite. It's a surprisingly effective fuel source. Every cell I filled in that spreadsheet felt like a middle finger to Chloe and her mother, to everyone who'd written me off as too expensive to bother with, to the universe itself for dealing me this particular hand of cards. $12 an hour doesn't sound like much, but when you're paying medical bills that look like phone numbers from another country, every penny feels like a small act of rebellion. I was surviving one spreadsheet at a time. And yeah, it was pathetic and exhausting, and sometimes I'd cry from sheer frustration when my hands wouldn't cooperate or my brain couldn't focus through the chemo fog. But I was doing it. I was still here, still fighting, still proving that I wasn't disposable. Mr. Wallace seemed to understand this on some level that didn't require words. He'd show up during his rounds, humming those gospel songs that had become the soundtrack to my survival, and he'd just start fixing things. My bedside lamp that flickered like it was trying to communicate in Morse code. Fixed. My phone charger that only worked if you held it at exactly 37 degrees. Fixed with electrical tape and what I'm pretty sure was just sheer determination. Even my sense of humor, which had been pretty thoroughly destroyed by everything that had happened, somehow Mr. Wallace helped fix that too, just by being present and calm and completely unbothered by the fact that I was a mess. "You're tougher than you look," he said one night after I'd finished a particularly brutal shift of data entry that had taken me twice as long as it should have because I'd had to stop every 20 minutes to either vomit or just stare at the ceiling and question my life choices. I looked at him, this quiet janitor who'd somehow become one of the most important people in my life, without either of us really acknowledging it. "Don't set the bar too high," I croaked, my voice still rough from being sick. "At this point, I'm surviving out of pure sarcasm and spite. If those ever run out, I'm screwed." He smiled, this small, knowing smile that suggested he'd heard that kind of talk before and knew it for what it was. Armor disguised as jokes. "Spite's kept a lot of people alive longer than hope ever did," he said, then went back to mopping, humming something that sounded like Amazing Grace, but slower, sadder, like grace was something you had to fight for instead of something that just showed up. The hospital coffee became my other survival mechanism, though calling it coffee was generous. It tasted like someone had burned dirt, mixed it with regret, and served it in a styrofoam cup that leaked sadness. But it was free, and it was caffeinated, and it gave me something to do with my hands during the long stretches between data entry sessions when I was too wired to sleep but too exhausted to do anything productive. I'd sit there sipping my terrible coffee, watching the sun come up through my window, thinking about how my life had become this weird combination of medical crisis and soul-crushing office work. And somehow I just kept going. Because what else was I going to do? Give up? Let Chloe and Beatrice be right about me? Let cancer win without at least making it work for the victory? Absolutely not. I was going to survive out of pure, stubborn spite, if it killed me, which I realized was kind of contradictory, but whatever. Consistency wasn't really my strong suit anymore. Anyway, 3 months into my personal tour of hell, which included, but was not limited to, constant nausea, a bank account that looked like a typo, and the kind of exhaustion that makes sleeping feel like a full-time job, my phone rang with a number I'd deleted but apparently still had memorized because trauma has a funny way of burning certain things into your brain whether you want them there or not. For exactly one stupid, pathetic second, my heart did that thing where it jumps up all hopeful like a dog that doesn't understand its owner abandoned it at a rest stop 3 states back. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe she'd realized what a massive mistake she'd made. Maybe she'd spent the last 3 months consumed with guilt and regret and had finally worked up the courage to beg for forgiveness. Yeah, I should have known better. "Hey," Chloe said when I answered, her voice doing that fake casual thing people do when they're about to drop a bomb but want to pretend it's no big deal. "How are you feeling?" I actually laughed, which turned into a cough, which reminded me that my body was still actively trying to kill me from the inside out. Oh, you know, living the dream. Vomiting regularly, can't keep food down, basically look like a hairless mole rat, working a data entry job that pays less per hour than your manicures cost. Just fantastic. Thanks for asking. 3 months later. There was a pause, the kind that told me she was trying to figure out if I was being sarcastic or genuine, which was hilarious because when had I ever not been sarcastic? "I'm glad you're doing better," she said, completely missing the point in that special way she had of hearing only what she wanted to hear. "Chloe, I'm not doing better. I'm doing slightly less terrible, which is not the same thing, but I'm guessing you didn't call for a health update, so why don't you just tell me what you want?" Another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear her gathering her nerve on the other end of the line. "I talked to my lawyer," she finally said, and there it was, the real reason for the call. "He says it would be better for both of us if you signed the divorce papers now. Cleaner, less complicated. We can just move on with our lives." I sat there in my hospital bed, which had become more familiar to me than my own apartment at this point, and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak. I'd already processed that during the 2 weeks I'd spent crying into hospital pillows that smelled like industrial detergent. This was something different, something sharper. "Better for both of us," I repeated slowly. That's interesting phrasing, considering one of us is fighting cancer alone while working 3 times as hard to stay alive, and the other one left because it was inconvenient. "That's not fair," Chloe said, and I could hear the edge in her voice now, that defensive tone she always got when someone pointed out that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the hero of every story. "I can't spend my best years watching someone fade away. That's not what I signed up for." "You signed up for marriage," I said, louder than I intended, loud enough that a nurse walking past my room glanced in with concern. "That was literally the entire point of the ceremony. We spent $20,000 on the vows, the cake nobody liked, your mother giving that speech about commitment. Remember any of that?" "You're being dramatic," she said. which was absolutely her go-to move whenever she didn't want to acknowledge that she might be wrong. "I'm trying to do this the mature way." "The mature way," I said, and I could hear the bitter laugh in my own voice, "would have been sticking around. The mature way would have been having this conversation in person instead of abandoning me and then calling 3 months later to make sure the paperwork goes smoothly. But sure, let's talk about maturity." "See, this is exactly why we can't work," Chloe said, her voice going cold in that way it did when she decided she was the victim and everyone else was just being unreasonable. "You're so angry all the time now. This isn't the man I married." "You're right," I said, feeling something click into place, something final and irreversible. "The man you married had hair and health insurance and a wife who pretended to love him. That guy's gone. This version survived cancer treatment, abandonment, and data entry at $12 an hour. This version knows exactly what he's worth, and more importantly, what he's not worth wasting time on." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you didn't watch me fade, Chloe. You left before the commercial break. You don't get to call now and act like you were there for the hard parts. You weren't. You chose not to be. So yeah, I'll sign your papers, but not because it's better for both of us, because I deserve better than someone who puts a price tag on love and decides I'm not worth the investment." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you didn't watch me fade, Chloe. You left before the commercial break. You don't get to call now and act like you were there for the hard parts. You weren't. You chose not to be. So yeah, I'll sign your papers, but not because it's better for both of us, because I deserve better than someone who puts a price tag on love and decides I'm not worth the investment." I could hear her breathing on the other end, could imagine her standing in whatever perfect apartment she was living in now, probably with her mother nearby, offering moral support and validation. "I'll have my lawyer send them over," she said finally, all business now, the mask firmly back in place. "You do that," I said, "and Chloe, lose my number, for real this time." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking from adrenaline, and probably also from the chemo, and just sat there staring at my phone like it had personally betrayed me, which, in a way, it kinda had. Stupid thing wouldn't stop working just because I wanted to throw it against the wall and watch it shatter into a million pieces that represented my marriage. Mr. Wallace showed up about 20 minutes later, pushing his mop cart with that steady, unhurried rhythm he had, humming something low and gospel-inflected. He took one look at my face and didn't say anything, just kept mopping, but he mopped slower near my bed. His presence, this quiet, solid thing that somehow made the room feel less empty. "My ex-wife just called," I said, not sure why I was telling him, but needing to tell someone who wouldn't try to fix it or make it better or offer platitudes about time healing all wounds. "Wants me to sign divorce papers so she can move on with her life." Mr. Wallace nodded, wrung out his mop with careful precision. "Some people," he said quietly, "don't know the difference between what costs money and what has value." I let that sit for a minute, turning it over in my head. "Yeah," I said, finally. "Yeah, I think you're right." After he left, I found a sticky note in my bedside drawer, probably left over from when the nurses were tracking my medication schedule, and wrote on it in shaky handwriting, "You're not disposable." I stuck it on the mirror in my bathroom, right at eye level, where I'd see it every time I looked at my reflection, which currently resembled the before photo in one of those dramatic survival documentaries where the person barely makes it out alive but comes back stronger. I read it out loud a few times, testing how it felt in my mouth. "You're not disposable." It sounded fake at first, like affirmations people post on Instagram next to pictures of their perfectly filtered lives. But I kept saying it anyway, every morning when I woke up and every night before I fell asleep, repeating it until it started to feel less like a lie and more like a possibility. The divorce papers showed up 4 days later via courier, because apparently Chloe's lawyer was efficient, if nothing else. I signed them in the hospital cafeteria over terrible coffee and a turkey sandwich that tasted like cardboard's less ambitious cousin. And I didn't cry. Didn't feel much of anything, except this weird sense of relief, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten it was there until I finally put it down. I mailed them back that same day with a stamp I'd bought from the hospital gift shop, which felt appropriately depressing. Ending your marriage via mail from a cancer ward, but it was done, officially over, officially unsubscribed from a relationship that had terms and conditions I'd apparently never read carefully enough. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, bald, gaunt, connected to an IV pole like I was on some kind of really depressing leash, and read my sticky note again. "You're not disposable," I said to my reflection. And this time, for the first time, I almost believed it. I'd been in the hospital long enough that I'd started recognizing patterns in things nobody should ever have to notice. Like how the lunch cart squeaked on Tuesdays but not Thursdays, or how the afternoon shift nurse always hummed off-key versions of 80s pop songs while checking vitals, or how the kid in the room next to mine cried every night around 8:30 like clockwork. Not loud crying, not the kind that brings nurses running, but this quiet, heartbreaking sound that seeped through the walls and made me want to punch something, preferably the universe itself, for being cruel enough to let children get cancer. His name was Leo Cruz, and he was 7 years old, which I learned from overhearing nurses talking in hushed voices outside my door like I couldn't hear them through the paper-thin walls. 7. The age when you're supposed to be worried about homework and whether you're going to get that new video game for your birthday, not whether your white blood cell count is trending in the right direction. He had leukemia, the kind with a long medical name I couldn't pronounce even before chemo had turned my brain into Swiss cheese. And his parents couldn't visit much because they both worked 2 jobs and lived 3 towns away, which meant he was alone most of the time, except for nurses who were too busy to do more than the basics. I met him officially about a week after he'd moved in, when I was shuffling down the hallway doing my daily walk that the doctors insisted was important for recovery, but felt more like an Olympic event given my current physical condition. He was standing outside his room in one of those hospital gowns that makes everyone look like they're wearing a decorated paper bag, staring at the vending machine like it held the secrets to the universe. "It's rigged," I said, because apparently my social skills had degraded along with my immune system. "The chips on the second row always get stuck." He looked up at me with these huge brown eyes that seemed way too old for his face, taking in my bald head and IV pole with a kind of matter-of-fact assessment only kids can manage. "You have cancer, too," he said. Not a question, just a statement of observable fact. "Yeah," I said, because what else do you say? "The not fun kind." "Is there a fun kind?" he asked, and I actually laughed, which hurt but felt worth it. "Fair point. What are you in for?" "Leukemia," he said, pronouncing it carefully like he'd practiced. "The doctors say I'm doing good, though, better than last month." "Well, that's something," I said, and we stood there for a minute in companionable silence, 2 bald guys in hospital gowns staring at a vending machine neither of us had the energy to fight with. That's when I noticed he was holding a plastic medicine cup, one of those little ones they use for pills, and he was looking at it with this intense concentration. "What have you got there?" I asked. "Building materials," he said seriously, then explained that he'd been collecting the cups from his medications and trying to build towers, but they kept falling over because the cups were too light and the hospital room floor wasn't level. I looked at this 7-year-old kid who was fighting cancer and dealing with absent parents and being alone in a scary place, and he was worried about architecture and structural integrity. "You know what?" I said. "I've got a whole collection of those cups in my room. Want to pool our resources and see what we can build?" His face lit up in a way that made my chest hurt worse than the chemo ever had. And just like that, we became engineering partners in the world's most depressing construction project. We started small, basic towers made from stacking cups on top of each other, which fell over immediately and made Leo giggle in this pure, unself-conscious way that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then we got more ambitious, creating wider bases and experimenting with different stacking patterns. I'd sit on the floor of his room because the chairs were uncomfortable anyway, and we'd work in silence, punctuated by his running commentary about load-bearing structures and weight distribution, concepts he'd apparently learned from watching building shows with his dad before all this happened. Mr. Wallace started joining us sometimes, not saying much, but clearly supervising our architectural disasters while pretending to mop. He'd pause near our construction site, lean on his mop handle, and nod approvingly when we managed to get a tower higher than 3 cups without it immediately collapsing. Once he even contributed some extra cups he'd found somewhere, though I suspected he'd been stockpiling them specifically for our projects. "You're really bad at this," Leo informed me one afternoon when I'd knocked over our most ambitious tower yet, a spiraling structure we'd been calling the Leaning Tower of Medicine. "Hey, I'm doing my best with shaky hands and chemo brain," I protested. "Besides, you're the architect here. I'm just the assistant who follows orders." "A really clumsy assistant," he said, but he was smiling, and I realized this was the first time I'd heard him talk without that undercurrent of sadness that seemed to follow him around like a shadow. We built skyscrapers between chemo drips, creating elaborate structures that would stand for hours before a passing nurse or a slight vibration would send them tumbling down in a cascade of plastic that sounded like rain. Leo would document our creations with his mom's old phone, taking pictures from different angles, like we were building actual architectural marvels instead of towers made from medical waste. He showed me his photo gallery once, dozens of pictures of cup towers in various stages of completion and collapse, each one captioned with names like the Empire State Building but smaller, and the one that lasted until dinner. His parents came to visit on a Saturday, both of them looking exhausted in that bone-deep way that comes from working yourself to death just to keep your head above water. His mom cried when she saw him, gathering him up in this fierce hug that made me have to look away because it felt too private, too raw. His dad shook my hand and thanked me for spending time with Leo, his voice cracking on the words, and I wanted to tell him that Leo was helping me as much as I was helping him, maybe more. But I didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was minimizing their struggle. After they left, Leo was quiet for a while, sitting on his bed and staring at the cup tower we'd built that morning, a modest structure, about 8 cups high, that we'd managed to stabilize with careful placement. "They have to work," he said finally, "to pay for all this, the doctors and the medicine and everything." "Yeah," I said, because what else could I say? The system was broken, and we were all just trying to survive it. "When I grow up," Leo said, his voice getting that determined quality kids get when they're making serious promises, "I'm going to be rich, and then I'm going to make sure kids don't have to be alone in hospitals because their parents are working." I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been sealed shut since Chloe left, since I'd realized how alone I actually was in all this. "That's a good goal," I managed to say. "Really good." That night, lying in my own bed and staring at my own water-stained ceiling, I thought about Leo and his absent parents, and his cup towers, and his determination to fix a broken system when he grew up. I thought about how when Leo laughed, really laughed, not the polite kind, but the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, the cancer felt smaller somehow, like it was still there, still trying to kill me, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. I'd spent months thinking survival was just about me, about proving Chloe wrong, about making it through out of pure spite and stubbornness. But watching Leo build towers out of medicine cups with hands that shook from treatment, seeing him smile despite everything he was going through, I realized something that should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't. Surviving wasn't just for me anymore. It was for the people who still believed I had something to give. For a 7-year-old who needed someone to build ridiculous structures with between chemotherapy sessions. For Mr. Wallace, who showed up every night with his gospel hymns and his quiet understanding. For Rhonda, who fought bureaucracy like it was a personal enemy. I wasn't just fighting cancer anymore. I was fighting to be the kind of person who deserved the faith these people, these unlikely, unexpected people, had somehow decided to place in me. And maybe, just maybe, that was a better reason to survive than spite ever was. Fast forward 5 years, and somehow, against all medical odds, statistical probability, and my ex-wife's confident predictions, I was still alive. Not just alive in the technical sense of having a pulse and occasionally remembering to breathe, but genuinely, stubbornly, spitefully alive in a way that felt like giving the universe a daily middle finger. The doctors used words like remission and remarkable recovery with the kind of cautious optimism people use when they don't want to jinx things. And I'd gone from being the guy everyone expected to die to being the guy who absolutely refused to, which honestly felt like the biggest plot twist of my entire existence. But here's the thing nobody tells you about surviving cancer when you're broke. Beating the disease doesn't magically fix your bank account or erase the mountain of medical debt that's been accumulating interest like it's training for the Olympics. I'd survived, sure, barely, but I'd emerged on the other side looking at bills that had more zeros than I'd seen since my high school calculus class, the one I'd nearly failed because I was too busy being 17 and stupid to pay attention to anything useful. So I worked. Not one job, like a normal person with reasonable life goals and healthy boundaries, but 3 jobs, because apparently my survival instinct had kicked into overdrive and decided that sleep was optional and free time was for quitters. During the day, I worked at a warehouse, one of those massive distribution centers that makes you feel like an insignificant cog in a machine designed by someone who actively hated human beings. I'd spend 8 hours lifting boxes that all weighed exactly enough to make your back hurt, but not enough to justify complaining about it. Scanning barcodes until my eyes crossed, and trying not to think about how I'd gone to college specifically to avoid this kind of soul-crushing manual labor. At night, I stocked shelves at a grocery store, which sounds easy until you've spent 4 hours rotating canned goods and reorganizing cereal boxes while fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were slowly draining your will to live. There's something deeply existential about alphabetizing pasta sauce at 2 in the morning while a radio plays the same 6 songs on repeat, and you wonder if this is what surviving cancer was supposed to feel like. Exhausting, repetitive, and vaguely depressing in a way you can't quite articulate. And in between, during those precious few hours that normal people used for things like sleeping or having a social life or maintaining their mental health, I did data entry for Data Stream Solutions, still typing numbers into spreadsheets for $12 an hour like I had been in the hospital. Except now my hands didn't shake from chemo, and I only occasionally wanted to throw my laptop out the window instead of constantly. My diet had become 70% ramen. And I'm not talking about the fancy artisanal ramen from those trendy restaurants where a single bowl costs more than my hourly wage. I'm talking about the brick of sadness kind that costs 29 cents and tastes like salt had a fight with regret and they both lost. I'd gotten creative with it out of sheer desperation, adding eggs when I could afford them, throwing in frozen vegetables that were on sale, occasionally splurging on hot sauce to pretend I was eating something that had flavor instead of just sodium and broken dreams. 20% of my diet was instant coffee, the cheap kind that came in a giant container and tasted like someone had burned disappointment and mixed it with water. But it kept me awake and functional, which was really all I was asking for from my beverages at this point. I drank it black because milk cost extra money I didn't have, and I'd convinced myself that the bitterness was building character, though honestly it was probably just destroying my stomach lining. The remaining 10% was pure spite, meaning I was running on anger and stubbornness and the bone-deep satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. Every bill I paid off, every shift I completed, every morning I woke up still breathing felt like a personal victory over Chloe and her mother and everyone who'd written me off as a bad investment. Spite turns out to be surprisingly nutritious when you're trying to survive on basically nothing. I lived in a studio apartment that was generous in the same way calling a shoebox cozy is generous. It was small, cramped, and made you reconsider your life choices every time you walked through the door. The place smelled like a combination of burnt noodles and determination, which probably should have been concerning, but honestly just felt appropriate given my current life situation. The walls were so thin, I could hear my neighbor, an elderly guy named Frank, sneeze from across the apartment, and then I'd hear him apologize to himself afterward, which was simultaneously depressing and kind of endearing. Frank and I had developed this weird rapport based entirely on the fact that we could hear each other's entire lives through the walls. He'd hear me come home at 3 in the morning from my grocery store shift, and I'd hear his TV playing westerns at a volume that suggested he was either hard of hearing or really committed to the experience. Sometimes he'd knock on my door with leftover casserole his daughter had brought him, claiming he couldn't finish it alone, but really just being kind in that subtle way old people have perfected, where they help you without making you feel like charity. "You work too hard," he'd say, handing over a Tupperware container of something that actually contained vegetables and protein and other nutrients I'd mostly forgotten existed. "Just trying to pay off some bills," I'd say, taking the food gratefully because my pride had learned to take a back seat to my empty stomach. "Debt from the cancer?" he'd ask, because apparently my medical history was also audible through the walls. "Among other things," I'd say, and he'd nod knowingly, pat my shoulder, and shuffle back to his apartment to watch more westerns at volumes that could probably be heard from space. Still, despite the exhaustion and the ramen and the constant feeling like I was one missed shift away from financial collapse, I was proud. Genuinely, surprisingly proud, in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I'd paid off almost all my medical bills. Not all of them, because that mountain was Everest-sized and I was climbing it with a spoon, but enough that I could see progress. Actual measurable progress that showed up in my bank statements and made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely drowning anymore, just treading water in the deep end. No wife, obviously. Chloe was somewhere out there living her best life without the inconvenience of a sick husband, and I genuinely hoped she was happy in that distant way you hope for people you used to love before you realize they were never really capable of loving you back. No savings, because every penny I made went straight to bills or rent or ramen, with nothing left over for things like emergency funds or planning for the future, or any of those adult concepts that seemed designed for people who hadn't spent their late 20s fighting cancer and abandonment simultaneously. No hair either, weirdly enough. It had grown back after chemo, but in this bizarre curly pattern that made me look like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket and decided to keep the look. My barber had actually laughed the first time I came in, not meanly, but in that surprised way people laugh when confronted with something unexpected. And I'd just shrugged, because, honestly, after everything I'd been through, weird hair barely registered on my list of concerns. But I was alive. Genuinely, stubbornly, impossibly alive. And yeah, my life looked nothing like what I'd imagined when I was younger and stupider and thought things like marriage and career success were guarantees instead of privileges, but it was mine. I'd built it from nothing, from the ashes of the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And every shift I worked, and every bill I paid, and every morning I woke up in my tiny apartment that smelled like burnt noodles felt like proof that I'd survived something that should have killed me. Sarcasm had replaced therapy, which probably wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, but was significantly cheaper and didn't require scheduling appointments or talking about my feelings with a stranger who nodded sympathetically while taking notes. I'd learned to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The fact that I'd survived cancer only to be defeated by grocery store shifts and instant ramen. The way my life had become this weird endurance test that nobody had asked me to take, but I was apparently acing anyway. And some nights, usually around 2 in the morning when I was too tired to sleep but too wired to rest, I'd sit on the floor of my apartment eating ramen straight from the pot because washing dishes felt like too much effort. And I'd think about how far I'd come from that hospital bed where my wife had told me I was too expensive to save. I'd think about Rhonda with her binder and her determination, about Mr. Wallace with his gospel songs and his quiet kindness, about Leo and his medicine cup towers and his dreams of fixing the world. And I'd realize that maybe I hadn't just survived. Maybe I'd actually won. It was a Tuesday night, which I only knew because my work schedule had Tuesdays highlighted in yellow as warehouse closing shift followed by grocery store opening shift, meaning I had exactly 4 hours between jobs to sleep, eat, and question my life choices in that order. The time was 8:17 p.m., which I noticed because I'd just gotten home from the warehouse and was doing my nightly ritual of taking off steel-toed boots that had molded to my feet in ways that were probably medically concerning, while simultaneously trying to decide if I had the energy to actually cook ramen or if I should just eat it crunchy straight from the package like the world's saddest potato chip. I'd chosen the cooking route because even my rock-bottom standards had limits, and I was standing in my kitchenette. Calling it a kitchen would be generous since it was basically a hot plate, a mini fridge, and counter space the size of a cafeteria tray, waiting for water to boil in a pot I'd owned since college when someone knocked on my door. Not the tentative tap-tap-tap of my neighbor Frank checking if I wanted leftover meatloaf, but 3 polite, confident knocks that sounded like they came from someone who'd never questioned whether they belonged somewhere. I looked down at myself, wearing sweatpants that had a hole near the knee and a t-shirt that advertised a 5K run I'd never actually participated in but had gotten for free from a work event, and seriously considered just pretending I wasn't home. People who knocked with that kind of confidence at 8:17 on a Tuesday night were either selling religion or selling something worse, and I had neither the energy nor the disposable income for either option. But curiosity has always been my fatal flaw, right up there with misplaced optimism and a tendency to make poor life decisions. So I turned off the burner, because burning down my apartment would really complete my run of bad luck, and opened the door. Standing in my hallway, looking like he'd wandered out of a lawyer commercial that played during daytime TV, was a man who screamed money in every possible way. He was maybe 60, with silver hair styled in that casually perfect way that probably cost more than my monthly rent, wearing an Armani suit that I only recognized because I'd once dated a girl who was obsessed with fashion magazines back when I had both hair and hope. He was holding a leather briefcase that looked like it had never seen the inside of a subway car, and he was smiling at me with the kind of professional warmth that comes from years of delivering news to people who weren't sure if they should be excited or terrified. "Mr. Lawson?" he asked, and his voice had that smooth quality that suggested he'd gone to one of those fancy schools where they teach you how to sound trustworthy while potentially ruining your life. "Depends on who's asking," I said, because I'd learned the hard way that admitting your identity to strangers could lead to anything from jury duty to subpoenas, and I really didn't need either of those things added to my current plate of chaos. "My name is Gregory Alden," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card that probably cost more per square inch than my entire wardrobe. "I'm an attorney with Alden and Hart. May I come in? I'm here about a rather substantial inheritance." I actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on, doubled-over, probably concerning laugh that made my ribs hurt and my eyes water. Behind me, my ramen water started boiling over with a hissing sound that perfectly captured the absurdity of this moment. "An inheritance?" I repeated, trying to catch my breath, while also trying to figure out if this was some elaborate scam or if I'd finally snapped from exhaustion and was hallucinating. "Listen, Mr. Alden, I appreciate the effort, but the only inheritance I'm expecting is debt, more debt, and maybe some aggressive sarcasm from my inner monologue. You've definitely got the wrong apartment. Try next door. Frank probably has relatives with money." But Gregory Alden didn't look embarrassed or confused or like someone who'd made a mistake. He just stood there with his leather briefcase and his expensive suit and his patient smile, waiting for me to stop laughing like a crazy person. "I assure you, Mr. Lawson, I have the correct address. The inheritance in question is approximately $63 million, and the donor specifically requested you by name. The world kind of tilted sideways for a second, and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself because my brain had apparently short-circuited somewhere between 63 and million. I'm sorry, did you just say 63 million? As in with 6 zeros? As in more money than I've seen in my entire life combined, including that time I accidentally looked at someone else's bank statement at the ATM? 63 million, yes, Gregory confirmed, like we were discussing something completely normal instead of an amount of money that existed only in lottery fantasies and fever dreams. Perhaps we should discuss this inside. I have quite a bit of paperwork to go through, and your hallway, while charming, isn't exactly conducive to legal proceedings. I stepped aside, because what else was I going to do? And Gregory Alden walked into my studio apartment with the kind of grace that suggested he was used to much nicer surroundings, but was too professional to show it. He glanced around, taking in the futon that doubled as my bed and couch, the stack of ramen containers I'd been meaning to recycle, the pot of water still boiling over on my hot plate, and the general air of barely holding it together that permeated every surface. "Please, have a seat," I said, gesturing to my one chair, which I'd found on the curb 3 years ago and had never quite trusted to hold more than 150 pounds. I turned off the stove, moved my dinner dreams aside, and sat on my futon, which creaked in protest because even my furniture was exhausted. Gregory set his briefcase on my makeshift coffee table, a plastic storage container I turned upside down, and opened it with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. Inside were folders, documents, papers with official-looking seals and signatures that made my eyes cross just looking at them. "I understand this must be quite shocking," he said, pulling out a folder and opening it to reveal what looked like a legal document written in that special language lawyers use that sounds like English but really isn't. The donor was very specific about wanting this to be a surprise, though I did advise that perhaps some warning might be appropriate. "Warning would have been great," I said, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. Maybe a text message, an email, a carrier pigeon, literally anything that would have prepared me for a random lawyer showing up at my door talking about more money than I've earned in my entire life. Gregory smiled, and it was genuine this time, not professional. The donor had a flair for the dramatic, I'm afraid. He wanted you to experience the full impact of his gesture. "He," I said, latching on to the pronoun because my brain was desperately trying to make sense of this situation. Who the hell do I know who has 63 million? I shop at discount grocery stores, and my most valuable possession is a coffee maker I got on sale. Gregory pulled out another document, and I saw a name written at the top in official legal script that made my heart stop and restart in the space of a single breath. "The donor was Arthur Wallace," Gregory said, watching my face carefully. "I believe you knew him as Mr. Wallace, the janitor from Denver Memorial Hospital." I stared at him. Then I stared at the document. Then I stared at him again because clearly someone had made a mistake, a huge, impossible mistake that was going to be really embarrassing when they figured it out. "Mr. Wallace," I said, slowly, like testing the words to see if they'd make sense coming out of my mouth. "The janitor? The guy who hummed gospel songs and fixed my phone charger with electrical tape and left crackers on my hospital tray? That Mr. Wallace had 63 million? "Indeed," Gregory confirmed. "He was quite wealthy, though he chose to live modestly." I started laughing again, except this time it came out more like crying, or maybe some combination of both that didn't have a name, because it was the sound of someone's entire reality shifting on its axis. "He couldn't even spell my name right on the vending machine label he put on my IV pole," I said, and tears were definitely streaming down my face now. He called me Lawson for 3 months, and I never corrected him because it didn't matter, because he was kind and he showed up and he gave a damn when nobody else did. And now you're telling me he had enough money to buy a small island? He was a retired inventor, Gregory explained, pulling out more documents that I couldn't focus on because my vision was blurry with tears. He held several patents on medical delivery systems, IV pumps, medication dispensers, that sort of thing. They're used in hospitals worldwide. He made a considerable fortune from the royalties, but he lived simply and worked as a hospital janitor because, according to his personal notes, he wanted to stay connected to the people his inventions were supposed to help. I put my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. Why me? Why would he leave his money to me? Gregory reached into the folder again and pulled out a single piece of paper, and his voice softened when he read it. In his will, he wrote, "For the man everyone left to die, but who kept living anyway. Tell him his wife was wrong. He wasn't too expensive to save." That sentence hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs and the strength out of my bones. I remembered Mr. Wallace mopping my floor in silence, remembered him leaving crackers and granola bars, remembered him humming Amazing Grace while I cried into my pillow. I remembered thinking he was just being kind, just being a good person in a place where good people were in short supply. I'd never told him about Chloe, never mentioned what she'd said about me being too expensive to save. But somehow he'd known. Somehow he'd seen everything I was going through and decided that I mattered, that I was worth fighting for, that my life had value even when I couldn't see it myself. He changed my entire life, I said through tears, my voice breaking on every word. And I didn't even know his last name. Gregory Alden gave me a moment to completely fall apart, which I appreciated because I was doing it spectacularly, crying into my hands in my crappy studio apartment while a lawyer in an Armani suit sat on my curb-find chair and pretended not to notice that I'd devolved into a sobbing mess. Eventually, when I'd managed to pull myself together enough to form coherent sentences instead of just making wounded animal noises, he opened another folder from his briefcase of life-changing documents and started explaining exactly who Arthur Wallace had been. Turns out the guy who'd fixed my phone charger with tape and determination wasn't just some janitor who'd decided to spend his retirement pushing a mop around a cancer ward. He was a legitimate genius, the kind of person who probably could have been running a Fortune 500 company or teaching at MIT, but instead chose to spend his days cleaning floors and humming gospel songs to sick people who needed it. Gregory showed me patent documents with Arthur's name on them, official government papers with seals and signatures that proved beyond any doubt that the man who'd left me crackers on my hospital tray had invented some of the most widely used medical equipment in the entire healthcare industry. This one here, Gregory said, pointing to a patent dated 1987, is for an automated IV pump system that's currently used in approximately 60% of hospitals nationwide. And this one, he flipped to another page, is a medication delivery system that revolutionized how controlled substances are dispensed in medical settings. There are others, a total of 17 patents, all related to hospital equipment and medical technology. I stared at the documents like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics, my brain refusing to connect the man in these official papers with the guy who used to mop around my medicine cup towers with Leo. He held patents on medical delivery systems used worldwide, I repeated, trying to make the words feel real in my mouth. The guy who I watched fix a broken mop handle with duct tape and what I'm pretty sure was just optimism. He was worth over $60 million, Gregory confirmed. But he lived like he made minimum wage. According to his financial records, he owned his house outright, a modest 3-bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and his biggest monthly expense was his donation to the hospital's charity fund. Gregory paused, flipping through more papers. He worked as a janitor at Denver Memorial for 12 years after retiring from his company. Never told anyone who he really was. Just showed up, did his job, and went home. Why? I asked, because that was the part that didn't make any sense in a story that was already stretching the limits of believability. Why would someone with that much money and that much success spend their retirement mopping floors? Gregory pulled out what looked like a personal letter, handwritten in a shaky script that I immediately recognized as Arthur's handwriting. I'd seen it on notes he'd occasionally leave, reminders about which vending machine buttons to avoid or which nurses would sneak you extra pudding cups if you asked nicely. He wrote this about 5 years before he passed away, Gregory said. It was included with his will as an explanation of sorts. He handed me the letter, and I read it with tears blurring the words, having to blink repeatedly to make them come into focus. Arthur's handwriting was messy but deliberate, the writing of someone who'd spent more time working with his hands than with pens. I made my money off sick people, the letter read. Built machines that helped them, sure, but also made millions doing it. Seemed wrong to spend all that money on fancy cars and big houses while the people my machines were supposed to help couldn't afford to use them. So I went back to the hospitals, not as an inventor or a businessman, but as someone who could be there in the middle of the night when folks were scared and alone. Figured that was worth more than any patent ever was. I had to stop reading because I couldn't see through the tears anymore, and my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my cancer history and everything to do with the fact that I'd been in the presence of actual human goodness and hadn't even fully appreciated it at the time. He wrote specifically about you, Gregory said gently, pulling out another document from his seemingly endless supply of papers that were systematically destroying my emotional composure. These are notes he kept, personal observations from his time at the hospital. Would you like to hear them? I nodded, because apparently I was a masochist who enjoyed having his heart ripped out and put back together in the span of a single evening. Gregory cleared his throat and read in his professional lawyer voice that somehow made the words even more devastating. Patient in 304. Lawson, I think, though I keep writing it wrong. Got left by his wife today. She told him he was too expensive to save. Right there in the hospital room, like she was returning a defective appliance. He hasn't stopped being polite to the nurses, though, hasn't gotten mean or bitter, just keeps fighting. Reminds me why I do this job. He flipped to another entry. Lawson's working now, typing on his computer between getting sick from chemo. Rhonda got him set up with some data entry thing. Kid's determined, I'll give him that. Most people would have given up by now, but he just keeps going. Started building cup towers with the little cruise boy. Watching them laugh together while they're both fighting cancer. That's the kind of thing patents can't capture. Another page. Lawson told me today I'm tougher than I look. He's got it backwards. He's the tough one. Surviving on spite and sarcasm and stubbornness, but surviving. That's worth something. That's worth everything. Gregory looked up from the notes, his professional composure cracking slightly. The last entry about you was written 3 weeks before he passed away. If something happens to me, make sure Lawson knows he was worth saving. Give him the money. Let him prove his wife wrong. Let him live the life everyone said was too expensive. I couldn't even pretend to have it together anymore. I was full-on ugly crying, the kind of crying where you make embarrassing sounds and your face gets all red and snotty and you don't care because the emotion is too big to contain in anything resembling dignity. This man, this quiet, humble man who'd spent his evenings mopping floors and humming hymns, had seen me at my absolute worst and decided I was worth $63 million. Had seen me getting abandoned and sick and desperate and thought, that's the one who deserves everything I've built. He couldn't spell my name right, I said through sobs, which was a stupid thing to fixate on, but somehow felt important. 3 months, and he kept writing Lawson on labels and notes, and I never corrected him because it seemed rude, and now he's left me enough money to never worry about bills again. He knew how to spell your name, Gregory said quietly. I found the hospital admission records in his personal effects. He had your correct information written down. I think he just liked the nickname. that somehow made it worse and better at the same time. The idea that Arthur had been gently teasing me, creating this small intimacy in the middle of a cancer ward where everything else was clinical and terrifying. He'd seen me as a person, not a patient, as someone worth knowing, worth caring about, worth leaving a fortune to. "What am I supposed to do with $63 million?" I asked, not really expecting an answer, because it was more of an existential question than a practical one. Gregory smiled, closing his folders with the efficiency of someone who delivered this kind of news before, though probably not to someone sitting on a futon in sweatpants with holes in them. "According to his will, you're supposed to live. That's it. No strings attached, no requirements about how you spend it or what you do with it. He just wanted you to have the chance to live without worrying about money, without having to work 3 jobs, without having to prove to anyone that you're worth saving." He pulled out one final document, the official will, I assumed, based on the amount of legal jargon crowding every available space. "There is one clause," Gregory added. He requested that if you choose to donate any of the money, you consider helping other patients who've been abandoned by their families. But it's a request, not a requirement. The money is yours to do with as you wish. Of course, Arthur had thought about other people, even in his will. Of course, his last act of generosity came with a gentle suggestion about paying it forward. That was exactly who he'd been. Someone who saw suffering and tried to fix it, whether with inventions or donations or just showing up with crackers and gospel songs. "When did he die?" I asked, realizing I didn't even know when I'd lost him. "About 4.5 years ago," Gregory said. "It's taken this long to settle the estate and locate you. You've moved several times, and you weren't exactly easy to track down." 4.5 years. I'd been living in poverty, working myself to exhaustion, eating ramen, and surviving on spite, while $63 million had been waiting for me, left by a man who'd believed I deserved better. The timing was almost funny in a cosmic joke kind of way. I'd already proven I could survive, already shown I was tough enough to make it without the money, and now here it was anyway. "He really changed my entire life," I said, looking at Gregory and then at the papers spread across my upside-down storage container coffee table, and I never even got to thank him. Gregory stood, gathering his documents with practiced efficiency. "I think he knew," he said, "and I think that's why he did it." The next morning, my phone exploded like I'd accidentally become famous overnight. The news had broken. Cancer survivor inherits $63 million. And suddenly, everyone I'd ever met wanted to reconnect and offer their totally not suspicious congratulations. My voicemail filled up within an hour. Old classmates I was pretty sure had bullied me suddenly remembered how close we'd been. Distant cousins materialized out of nowhere with investment opportunities. Even my email was drowning in messages from people who'd forgotten I existed until I became worth something. Then came Chloe's call. "Babe," she said, and that nickname felt like a slap. "I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I panicked when you got sick. Can't we start over?" I actually laughed. "Let me guess, you've been soul-searching, maybe in the last 24 hours since the news broke." Silence. All the answer I needed. "Chloe, I fought cancer, abandonment, and poverty without you. I can't survive another toxic relationship. We're done." "You're being cruel," she said. "No, I'm being honest. Lose my number." Her mother, Beatrice, called next, coughing dramatically. "Sweetheart, your ex-wife is heartbroken." "Good," I interrupted. "So am I, about that $200 blender she took." I hung up and blocked them both. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car or any of the ridiculous things people probably expected me to waste money on after suddenly becoming obscenely wealthy. Instead, I created the Arthur Wallace Foundation for Abandoned Patients, a name that made lawyers nervous because apparently abandoned had legal implications, but I didn't care because that's exactly what it was for. People who'd been left behind by family or finances or a healthcare system that treated human lives like budget line items that needed to balance out. The Foundation's mission was simple and personal. We paid off medical debts for people who'd been abandoned during treatment. People like me, who'd been told they were too expensive to save and then had to figure out how to survive anyway. We covered bills for patients whose families had walked away, whose insurance had maxed out, whose GoFundMe campaigns had failed to go viral because apparently suffering isn't compelling content unless it comes with good photography and a catchy hashtag. Within the first year, we cleared over $12 million in medical debt. $12 million! That's not money, that's hundreds of lives. Hundreds of people who could finally breathe again without drowning in bills that had more zeros than hope. We worked with hospitals across the country, identifying patients who fit our criteria, reaching out quietly because nobody wants their abandonment broadcast like some kind of tragedy porn. Sometimes we'd get thank you letters that made me cry in my office. Now an actual office instead of a studio apartment that smelled like burnt ramen. Sometimes we'd get no response at all, and that was fine too, because dignity doesn't require gratitude. I kept Arthur's old janitor badge on my desk in a simple frame. No fancy display, just the laminated ID card with his photo looking exactly like I remembered him. Calm, kind, completely unimpressed by the chaos of the world around him. Visitors would ask about it sometimes, confused about why a millionaire philanthropist had a janitor's badge as his most prominent decoration, and I'd tell them the whole story. About the man who mopped floors and hummed gospel songs and left crackers for dying patients who had nobody else. About the inventor who chose connection over comfort, service over status. About the person who saw me at my worst and decided I was worth everything. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, a lingering side effect of trauma that money couldn't quite fix, I'd imagine Arthur walking into heaven's break room, pouring himself terrible coffee, and saying to whoever was in charge up there, "Told you that kid would make it." I never heard from Chloe again after blocking her number, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Rumor had it she was dating a chiropractor now, which I learned from a mutual friend who thought I'd want to know. I didn't particularly, but I did hope she'd finally found someone who could adjust her morals along with her spine, because clearly they'd been misaligned for years. As for me, I was cancer-free, debt-free, and finally living proof that sometimes the people who abandon you end up watching you on the evening news, probably choking on their expensive wine, while you're out there changing lives with money you earned by refusing to die when everyone said you should. I guess I wasn't too expensive to save after all, just too valuable for the wrong buyer.